Good morning. It is the 19th of February, 2024, President's Day in the United States, one of those holidays people tend to forget about until it comes upon them. Your banks are closed today for those who are watching this early and have plans of those sorts of things today. Why don't we start today, before we get to our main story, by giving you an update on that Cathedral story, because that story is causing a great deal of headaches for everybody who cares about the state of the church. A lot of Catholics are rightfully upset about it. So it turns out that Father James Martin knew about the thing ahead of time, and he did nothing about it. I'm not surprised that he knew about this and he did nothing about it. But here are the details from Pastor Jimmy Martin of the Jesuit Church about the actual funeral that desecrated St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York this past week. He says on Twitter, "Dear friends, the comments I gave to the New York Times about the memorial service for that person were given before the service, and assuming that St. Patrick's Cathedral had approved the service, which seemed like a compassionate gesture toward the deceased's family and friends. And I also assumed, based on the fact that the service was being held in St. Patrick's, that the person was a believer, which according to the New York Times, she was not. Obviously, I believe that the James Martin crowd should be as included as any other parishioner in the church. Just as obviously, I believe that churches are sacred spaces and certain actions are out of bounds. Full disclosure, I had been invited to preach, but was out of town." I'm going to pause. One wonders if he had not been out of town, if he would have actually gone to it. He was out of town at the LA Religious Conference, the Religious Ed Conference, the thing that in times where there weren't as many of these bizarre world stories in the Catholic news at all times, usually would dominate the news cycle, but it's barely going to get a mention this week. If you're familiar with the Religious Education Conference in LA, that Bishop Barron has spoken out about in the past, that he's given addresses to, James Martin is always there. That's where he was this week. He continues saying, "I've not seen the whole service as recorded, but some actions I've seen struck me as, while perhaps to the congregation joyful and celebratory, disrespectful of the sacred space that is St. Patrick's Cathedral. One can be both joyful and respectful, it seems to me. I would imagine that some congregants might say that they intended nothing disrespectful or offensive. But when in a church or some such place, I feel that you should always err on the side of respect and prudence. Most importantly, may the person in question rest in peace. May her friends and her family and all who knew her be consoled by her memory and by God's presence in her lives." Somebody asks, have they ever asked a member of the James Martin crowd to repent? Of course, he doesn't answer that question. I There's a lot going on in this series of tweets from Pastor Jimmy. A lot going on in there, where he doesn't address the elephant in the room, that the people who were there were not just being merely disrespectful. It was beyond that. The things that they were calling the person they were honoring there, the way they were invoking the saints with her and comparing her to the saints, was beyond just, quote, disrespectful. Such is his way of downplaying the errors of those whom he tends to represent. He never, ever addresses their errors in any forceful way. So that is your update there. Philip asks, who is paying for all of James Martin's travel? He probably can afford it himself. He publishes books and gives public addresses, and he gets compensated for that. So he could probably do it himself. So let's go to our actual main story for the day. So we're going to go here to the Catholic News Agency, who has an intro. Oh, come on, StreamYards. Let's try this again. We'll go to the Catholic News Agency, where we have this from Francis. The Synod on Synodality is about to recommence in the fall. And there's a lot of prep work that needs to go into it. I know it seems like we were talking about the Synod going up into, which closed in October, and then and we were talking about it into November until the treatment of Bishop Strickland happened. But the Synod on Synodality is not actually done. It picks back up in October and will run from the 2nd of October to the 27th of October. They'll issue a report, and then Francis will issue his own document after that's all said and done. And we will be covering that here on this channel, God willing, that we're all still here when it happens. And so we get this headline from the Catholic News Agency. Pope Francis launches study groups to analyze Synod on synodality's key issues. This is the next phase of the Synod on synodality. The key issues in that last document, there were a laundry list of these things that they were told that the Synod fathers said, we need to continue on this path. We need to have the church address a certain set of these issues. The James Martin crowd was one of them. The ladies' diaconate was another, a whole host of these things. But even those issues aren't the central theme of the Synod. The central theme of the Synod on synodality is decentralization of church authority. Cardinal McElroy issued something I'll cover later in the week where he said that they need to decentralize the church while respecting the hierarchy, which is a contradiction in terms. But that is the real aim of the Synod, is to put matters of doctrinal authority into the hands of laity. And because the laity are much bigger proponents of many of these radical changes in the church than many of the bishops and cardinals in the Roman Curia are. And so if you put that in the hands of the worst catechized generation in the history of the church, the authority on decision making for doctrinal matters, you are going to end up resulting in Francis's changes being not only really you can't undo them, but they'll be able to continue pushing further and further for things that Francis himself can't quite bring himself to do for one reason or another. So let's take a look at the article. He says, quote, the Vatican announced Saturday that Pope Francis has launched synodal study groups to analyze key issues ahead of October's Synod on Synodality Assembly. Pope Francis has issued a chirograph asking the dicasteries of the Roman Curia to collaborate with the General Secretariat of the Synod to establish study groups for in-depth analysis of some of the themes that emerge in the first Synod on Synodality Assembly. The Pope did not specify in the chirograph published on February 17th how many groups will be formed, what topics will be studied, or who will participate in the study groups. The synthesis report published at the end of the First Synod Assembly lists 75 different, quote, matters for consideration, including women's access to the diaconal ministry, priestly celibacy, and, quote, Eucharistic hospitality for interfaith couples. These matters of consideration, which could not find a consensus in the First Synodal Assembly, are defined as points on which we have recognized that it is necessary to continue theological, pastoral, and canonical deepening. In addition, the synthesis report also calls for the establishment of a special intercontinental commission of theologians and canonists to examine the definition and conceptual understanding of the, quote, idea and practice of synodality and its canonical implications, as well as the establishment of a joint commission of Eastern and Latin theologians, historians, and canonists, end quote. One of these, we've talked a lot about, of course, the deaconettes issue, the attempt to sweep away the ancient tradition of the priestly virtue, we'll call it, and others. But not a lot of talk happens about Eucharistic hospitality for interfaith couples. So let's have a moment here to talk about what that actually means. It used to be that the church took a very dim view of people engaging in holy matrimony with those outside the faith. They called it dangerous, and for good reasons. There was a very good chance that those who did engage the sacrament with those who were not Catholic would end up leaving the faith. An even better chance that their children would not be raised in the Catholic Church. The church today still requires that if you were to engage in the sacrament with somebody who is not Catholic, that they have to agree to have the children brought up in the faith. How many, and while they may pay lip service to that, how often do you think that actually happens in practice? Now, sometimes people do convert. That does happen, and God bless them for it. But this is where we're headed now. There has been open talk about giving the Eucharist to those who are not Catholic in the name of keeping peace in the home and as a matter of hospitality. They call it there in the synthesis document, Eucharistic hospitality. Sacrilegious communion in the name of Eucharistic hospitality. Take all the time you need to really wrap your head around this idea that we should make people feel nice while also desecrating the Eucharist. It's a really mind-boggling kind of thing to consider here. But I want to, get back. I want to take a look here at something, because we have this as an idea, as a good example of what all of this actually means on the James Martin subject. You see, he tweeted out a link to this article. Fascinatingly, the parent organization has me blocked on Twitter. Like, it blocked me on Twitter like as soon as I started their account. Guess that's a badge of honor. But he tweeted out this article. He says it's from Outreach, which is the James Martin's activist organization. And their headline on their article is James F. Keenan S.J., another Jesuit. The Synod should embrace the radically inclusive friendship of the James Martin crowd. And that's what we're talking about. That is apparently a Jesuit priest. I've never understood why it is that Jesuit priests often, like so many other modern priests, don't wear their habits or their clerics when they're required, when traditionally they would have been required to. I will say, to James Martin's credit, he is most of the time seen in his priestly attire, although I'm not sure why he does that, given that he is a modernist, but at least he's identifiable as a priest publicly. So I guess, my attempt to say something positive about people that I criticize every day, here's my attempt at doing so. Now, this was published a couple of weeks ago, but James Martin just tweeted this one out. So let's go over this logic here, because the idea is the Synod wants to make the church as inclusive and as welcoming as it can be. And the idea of this is simple. We surrender on the issues of sin. We surrender on the issues, the consequences of sin, and the calls to conversion and the calls to repent. That is core of what's here. And so this is what Outreach is all about. Their argument is that the church should recognize the James Martin crowd because they are humans, and because the church is focused on human well-being and flourishing in our time. And that's true. The church is focused on material concerns instead of on the four last things. But because of that reality, we should focus on recognizing the James Martin crowd's claims as being valid. And what are their claims? That they were created in the image and likeness of God, which is true, but the affliction that they carry, the sins they deal with, are not actually sins, that God made them that way. And that as such, they should be treated with dignity and accepted as they are. That is their claim. Their error, of course, is that God, that stuff what they deal with isn't a sin, and that God is okay with it. That is where, of course, where their error is. But groups like Outreach are heretical. They deny the inerrancy of Scripture. They tell us that these things aren't actually sins, and that the church needs to get with the times. And so here is this Jesuit priest talking about the Synod. He says, quote, philosophers from the 19th century, like George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, to contemporary figures like Axel Honneth, Paul Ricoeur, Charles Taylor, Nancy Fraser, and Judith Butler, have made it clear recognition is a basic social and human need. They argue that societies need to guide their members into the practice of recognition. Conversely, they also acknowledge that how hurtful and damaging the withholding of recognition is to people and groups. For the James Martin crowd, recognition is the quintessential response sought through the acts of stepping into the world. Though there are many other reasons for doing such, conquering fear, positive self-acceptance, being true to oneself and others, the immediate response that anyone doing this seeks is simple recognition. One socially discloses precisely to begin being truly recognized. In her very helpful Outreach essay, the James Martin crowd, the Synod, and blessing of the double S types, the theologian Lisa Soul Cahill highlights the conflicting issues at stake in developing a synodal pathway to recognize and receive the James Martin crowd. Indeed, when the Synod closed, not only were there no determinations about the James Martin crowd, there was no direct mention of them in the Synod report. Throughout her essay, Cahill helps us to remain synodal, that is, to not walk away from the table and to remain engaged in creative conversations of mutual respect and understanding precisely when there are moral disagreements. She realistically acknowledges, for instance, that some members of the James Martin crowd find their own well-being, their personal freedom, and even their existence at stake in a variety of places around the world, such that many do not dare to step out and ask for recognition in the first place. Cahill also helps us to see how the church's own lack of recognition of the James Martin crowd remains as an enduring experience for that group. Indeed, she notes that the large percentage of Catholics still see the James Martin sin as disordered, even though they may accept the Catechism's directive to respect and legally protect these people. End quote. That article goes on and openly calls for the language of disorder to be removed from the Catechism and from the through the Synod, and for the church to change its language on this. Reading that, I'm reminded of something, and what I'm reminded of is the African bishops. Do you recall that when The African bishops were given their pass for not having to implement fiducia supplicans and the diabolical blessings there. They were asked by Francis to work to change the culture. So it could be that the James Martin crowd would feel welcome in the broader culture and not have to worry about anything. You may be aware that Africa is not exactly the most, we'll call it the most open place about these things. They have a very traditional Christian understanding about such sins, and they tend to want to keep it that way. And Francis has actually asked the African bishops to help change the culture. Think about that for a second and the implications of that, and how that even makes any sense. I saw somebody actually reference something I'm going to close this with here in the chat, but we could just move on for a second here, though. The real issue of recognition is this, and the synodalists and the James Martin types don't understand what we're talking about. We certainly do recognize the James Martin crowd. We recognize them as having been made in the image and likeness of God. We recognize that they are, like the rest of us, called to a life of holiness, found in sanctifying grace through the sacraments of the church that are the material elements of the relationship that Christ seeks to have with all of us. Sin breaks that relationship. We're all guilty of sin. The difference is that the church hasn't traditionally sought to coddle us in our sin, not until recent decades. The James Martin crowd denies that what we're talking about is a sin at all, even though the faith has always been very, very clear on that. They want it made normal. They want us to accept a dubious set of claims from the engineers of the world about that sin and how it's a result of natural forces. The church is and has always been right on this issue of sin. The world is wrong on this issue, and the world broke away from its Christian moorings on this subject. And the James Martins of the world want us to accept the world's wisdom on this, not the actual wisdom of the church, which is founded on the divine protection the church has from the Holy Spirit. It's really a remarkable thing when you think about the implications of what they're saying. We recognize the James Martin crowd as human beings steeped in sin, like the rest of us, and that they need an interior conversion and to step away from sinful living, like the rest of us. It's just that the sins that they're so defensive of categorically are sins that cry out to heaven for justice. I'm going to close on this from a statement by Father Paul Kramer, who posted something on his Facebook that is about this news about the Synod that is really remarkable. If you're familiar with Father Paul Kramer's work, he's written several books, including some where he outlines a rather huge argument against Francis being valid and such. So for those of you who don't like that topic, you may not like him much, but I think you'll find what he has to say here rather remarkable. He says the synodal church is a false and schismatic church. It must be shunned because it has no authority from God. The heretical and Catholic in name only Bergoglian synodal church is in the act of breaking away formally from Catholicism and forming a visible and clearly recognizable separate non-Catholic entity. When it explicitly professes its twisted new dogmas and pushes its new bogus sacraments on its followers, then all the faithful of the Catholic Church will flee from the Bergoglian group and its affliction of false religion. Only those cowardly souls who willingly allow themselves to be taken in by the operation of error in order to not, quote, go into schism, will in fact fall into schism and separate themselves from Christ and his church by adhering to their counterfeit apostate pope and his counterfeit church. I expect that after the conclusion of the Synod in October, the heretical Reformed Church of Rome will become formally institutionalized with its heretical dogmas and obviously bogus sacraments and rites, although it will still attempt to maintain the imposture of being Catholic. When this happens, then the Catholics will separate themselves from those usurping moral leeches, and they will finally realize that the sectarians in charge of the Vatican are a gang of fanatically anti-Catholic radicals who have no jurisdiction from God and who have no claim on the obedience of Catholics. Then the Catholics will understand, somewhat too late, but not entirely too late, that pontifical monarchical rule and ordinary hierarchical governance have temporarily broken down, and that the church has devolved temporarily into a de facto more primitive form of governance, as Pope Gregory XVI explained in the passage I quoted in my 2 volumes. Let's pause there. He's referring to 2 books he wrote on the validity of Francis. You can find his bibliography for a reference to that. When the Catholic clergy and religious will finally abandon their psychological legalistic hang-up about obedience, jurisdiction, faculties, etc., and finally come to understand the applicability of the canonically and theologically recognized principle of natural equity to the present situation in the church, then the penny will finally drop, and they will easily grasp that no formal authorization from ordinary superiors are needed under such extraordinary circumstances that morally exclude all possibility of receiving them. The church supplies under these circumstances because Christ founded the church and formally enjoined that the church must function and operate according to the precepts that he solemnly commanded until the end of the world, when he comes to judge the living and the dead. Church pastors, even validly constituted, have no authority to destroy, but only to build up the church, as St. Paul explicitly stated. If formal canonical authorization cannot be obtained from a hierarchy possessed of ordinary jurisdiction, which actively works to destroy the church, whether knowingly or in ignorance, then the church supplies all faculties, jurisdiction, and permissions, because Christ himself has commanded the church to live and function as a living body, divinely instituted, which the unworthy or invalid human superiors have no authority to end. A de facto governance by independent bishops and priests is accordingly furnished with all necessary faculties and ecclesiastical power, as are pastorally required for the life of the church, to carry on until the normal form of hierarchical governance is restored. To assert the contrary is tantamount to accusing God of the injustice of commanding his ministers to carry out duties they cannot legitimately perform. It is blasphemy to suggest that God would command something without providing the grace and jurisdiction necessary to legitimately fulfill the command. Furthermore, the faithful have the right to their traditional rites and sacraments, and to pursue their God-given vocation to the consecrated or ecclesiastical state, even if the destroyers build barriers to prevent them from partaking of their traditional rites, or entering the traditional religious life or the seminary, because, as Cardinal Carberry explained in the Canonical Forms of Marriage, the God-given rights of the faithful prevail over the mere formalities of law. In all such cases, supplet ecclesia, the Church supplies. Catholics must shun and ignore the Vatican and its directives as if they did not exist, because they do not exist in the church, but outside of it only. Now, I am pretty sure some people were going to look at that and go, wow, that's a lot to take in. But again, the thesis that I have had for years here is that we are seeing the prophesized ape of the church, the false church of prophecy, being built now in our time. And that's been being built for decades. It's just becoming obvious now. Blessed Aunt Catherine Emmerich gave the most cogent description of this false church from a prophecy standpoint, but Fulton Sheen spoke about this too. The ape of the church, according to Blessed Aunt Catherine Emmerich, would be this. There would be essentially a false church calling itself the Catholic Church that would build this false edifice over the Catholic Church, and behind that edifice would be in the process of deconstructing the Catholic Church to replace it and bury the apostolic faith forever. How are we not seeing that today? How is it possible that we're not seeing that today? And yes, Blessed Aunt Catherine Emmerich's messages are approved. She was made a blessed by Benedict XVI. So, and he knew about her messages. For those of you who don't like private revelation, this is one of those pieces of private revelation that is kind of hard to ignore. Let's take a look in the live chat and see what people are saying before we wrap this up. I will have links to all this stuff in my show notes today at returntotradition.org for your consideration here within the probably 30 minutes of the stream being done. Eucharistic hospitality is open communion. That is factually true. That's what it would mean. It's even if it starts only with Eucharistic communion for people under very specific circumstances, you know as well as I do that they will make it, that will become open communion within just a few years. Do I ever sleep? Yes, I just keep odd hours. Tom Brestolo says, are SSB the image of God insofar as they are? No, that they are human beings, thus making them created in the image and likeness of God, but not with their afflictions. Just like the rest of us, except that theirs are rather explicitly ones that cry out to heaven for justice. Thank you, Miriam. I do appreciate it. Damien reminds us that the Fatima consecration has not been done, because it has not been done. Francis gave us the one that was the closest to what was asked for, but it was, Sister Lucia said, it's just that one country consecrated the heart of our consecrated per the instructions, just that one country, nothing else. And we can't, for some reason, authority figures in the church can't seem to do it. Of course, if he is not truly Pope, then Francis never even tried, because he didn't have the authority. All right, folks. thanks very much for tuning in. If there is anything else in the chat, this is your time to get it in. All of this is to try to justify the large number of priests and other religious groups, so they may openly show their own tastes. Yes, I think that's also partially true. Honestly, you notice that this push for the normalization of sins tend to come from very questionable priests themselves. Do I know when the Penton Filial Petition of Scholars is being republished? It was due to be on the 17th. No, but I'll keep an eye on Twitter. He'll absolutely post a link to it. I know that some names have been added to it. I think Bishop Strickland added his name to it. I think I saw him add his name to it on Twitter a few weeks ago. Colleen reminds us that Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich is the reason that church authorities knew where Mary's house would be found in Ephesus, Turkey. Benedict and John Paul II both went there. Right. So again, there are miracles that confirm the veracity of the things that Blessed Anne Catherine Emmerich said. And I have a gigantic 4-volume set, thanks to a patron and listener of the channel who mailed me the 4-volume set of these of her things here. We're still on volume 1. I haven't brought one message of hers in a while onto the channel, but it's still that her stuff should be taken seriously, I think. Chris says seeking recognition or approval is a mark of those who in their heart of hearts know that what they're doing is wrong, but getting it widely approved will make them feel better about themselves. Right. And that's also theologically the hallmark of modernism. Remember, modernism, according to Pope St. Pius X, states that the religious experience, that true religion comes from the internalized religion experience, what people, their feelings about things, basically. And I mean, it's more complicated than that. That's the sort of the quick version. Denver says open communion is another step to universalism. That's also true. So Virginia says the church will have the people and all the buildings, etc., will be owned by the ape of the church. Yeah, that's why you heard Archbishop Lefebvre say back in the 70s, he was the one to first invoke St. Athanasius, I think, who was a 4th century doctor of the church, who said that they, meaning the heretics of their day, who dominated the hierarchy of the church at the time, they had the buildings and that we, the faithful, had the faith. And St. Athanasius has become kind of our almost a guide stone in our time. Excuse me. All right, folks. Thanks very much for tuning in today. Please pray for everybody we talked about today, Pastor Jimmy Martin, the people who behind that wicked funeral, Francis and everybody involved at the synod, because they're going to talk about that laundry list of things they want to change about the church, and that's unacceptable. So thanks very much today. As always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.